Now, these two pshatim of what Shlomo did were the subject of a great debate and ongoing dispute in halacha, which has raged for over 100 years. In 1882, the first great aliyah to Eretz Yisrael took place. Where we look at it now, in that decade, in the 1880s, 25,000 Jews made aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. 25,000 Jews by today's standards is Baruch Hashem, it's a drop in the bucket. But at that time, this was a tremendous chidush. The Chayvei Tzion in much of Eastern Europe pushed Yidden, encouraged Yidden to move to Eretz Yisrael. And here you had young people idealistic towards raising the standard of living, towards making a permanent yishuv in Eretz Yisrael. And many of the Gedolei Yisrael were behind this, and we should know, because soon in Eretz Yisrael they'll celebrate the centennial of political Zionism, where Herzl in the 1890s started his movement of political Zionism. We should know that it didn't start with Herzl. It started with the Gedolei Yisrael of the generation who pushed, who encouraged Yidden to move to Eretz Yisrael. In 1882 was a shmita year, and b'daichei gadol, the Yidden in Eretz Yisrael kept the shmita. But before 1889, they sent letters to the menalim of the Chayvei Tzion movement, who were originally included in the Tziv, the Beis Halevi, and Rav Shmuel Mahalover, and others, who later, some of them resigned because they saw Chayvei Tzion became a secular-based organization. But at that time, they were Gedolei Yisrael, and they asked them whether there was any eitzah on shmita, because they were very poor immigrants in Eretz Yisrael, and they needed the proud produce of the land. And there was a meeting of the three Gaboim of the Chayvei Tzion, and they were split over this, and they were unable to resolve the issue. A few months later, three of the Gedolei Europe got together, besides Rav Shmuel Mahalover, who was one of pushed the Heter Mechira, but together with Rav Yehoshua Kutner, and Rav Shmuel Zanvil, Klepfish, the Dayan of Warsaw, the three of them got together and gave out a Heter Mechira, which meant that they held that the land in Eretz Yisrael could be sold to non-Jews for the Shemitah year, actually for the year previous also, to do Avodah in preparation for the Shemitah year and the Shemitah year. And that would be a heter for people to work the land. And if you'll say that the Mechira, it's not a real Mechira, it's a Harama, they weren't really selling the land. So they wrote that we find at least 5 places in Chazal such a concept of Mechira, of a Mechira to get around the Yisurim. We find it by Chametz, we sell Chametz. By Bechar, by Yisroel Bechar, a person who has a pregnant animal and wants not to have to give the Bechar should be Hegdish. We find in Mesechtes Ma'aser Sheni, Perek Daled, that a person who has to be paid the Ma'aser Sheni, the owner has to be paid, he has to add a Chaimish. If he wants to save the money, there's an Eitzah to give it away, b'matana. And then to be paid it as a non-owner. We find it in Mesechtes Nedarim, someone who made a neder not to have enough from someone else, and now he's desperate. The same eitzah that the person should give it away b'matana. So we find the 5th place, someone who forgot to make an erev tafshilin on Yom Tif. The Gemara says makne kimchay lacherim. He's makne his dough or his makne his raw meat to others, and they cook for him on Yom Tif. Halacha is full of such a concept of selling of a heter mechira. So they held that there's a heter mechira, we can sell the land on shmita to a guy, and this is totally if a guy's karka in Eretz Yisrael, if shmita applies, which is a separate machlaikis, they paskin that shmita b'zman hazeh d'Rabbanan, so the heter mechira applies, and they held that it's mutter to sell the land. However, they said that matir, they knew that there are others who argued with them, who held there was no such heter. So he said, B'tanai, that the Kovner Rav, the Paisik Hadar, Rabbi Yisrael Chanan, Mikavna, that he would agree with their psak. The letter was sent to Yisroel Kutner writes in Yeshua's Malka in his Truvis that this was sent to Rabbi Yisrael Chanan. He concurred, he held it was a heter mechira, but he made a tanai that the Bezdin Shel Yerushalayim should agree. What business do Rabbanei Chutz La'aretz have paskening for Eretz Yisrael? If the Bezdin Shel Yerushalayim will agree, then they're masking. The Bezdin Shel Yerushalayim did not agree. They were not masking to the heter mechira. They held that they're settling the land of Eretz Yisrael. They'll do it in the Lachatchila Dika'if. And in 1889, there was no basis for the heter mechira. The Nitziv at that time wrote a strong letter of condemnation of the heter mechira. He wrote, what's going on? Hareheim ki bayreach min haza'ev u'poga ba'ari. It's like a man who's running away from a wolf, and he runs into a lion's den. They're running, they're afraid of the Issa Shmita, which is a Drabanan. And here they're running in, they're involving themselves in the Issa Loisechanim, of selling Karka Eretz Yisrael to Goyim. It's an Issa. 7 years later, in 1896, the Matziv in Eretz Yisrael was much worse. And in that year, Rabbi Yehoshua diskin, the Zakene Yerushalayim held B'Teiras HaRashah to rely on the heter mechira. And again, in 1903, 2 consecutive shmitas, he paskin to rely on the heter mechira, and that's what happened in Eretz Yisrael. In 1910, Rabbi Yehoshua tried to retract his heter. He did retract his heter. He said he was matir in 96, and in 1903, it was a hirah. He held there was a question even of sakanas nefashis. In 1910, the matziv had improved, and he tried to retract this lamaisa. Rabbi Yehoshua diskin, Rabbi Shmuel Masalant, and the Slutzker Rav, the Rav of Tzfas, all put out an isser to rely on the heter mechira. And Kiyodua, Rav Kook, strongly held that the heter mechira was l'chatchila, and he held that it was mutter. And from that year and on, Eretz Yisrael nasu kitais. The land of Eretz Yisrael became a land in which there were different groups. The Talmidei Rav Kook relied on his heter, and they rely on the heter mechira not only in the years of it where the land was impoverished, but ad hayayim in many communities in Eretz Yisrael, they rely on the heter mechira. And the others who did not rely on the heter mechira. What is the basis for the heter? What about the Nitziv's Taina Loisei Chanei? So guess what? We find 2 basic heterim, the same 2 heterim that we use to explain Shlomo HaMelech. One possible heter is if you hold Loisei Chanei is mutter l'tayelas Yisrael. We said that that's a possible explanation of Shlomo, just like the other Isurim, mutter l'tayelas Yisrael. Loisei Chanei should be mutter l'tayelas Yisrael. If that's a heter, which we have no clear basis, printed basis for, but if you hold logically it's a heter, then here also, why are you selling the karka to the Arab? L'tayelas Yisrael. Or, now that heter many disagreed with, because in this particular Isur of Loisei Chanei we don't find the makar. The stronger heter that many of the Gedolim held of was the Rav Zolti writes that Loisei Chanei is a result-based Isur, to give a guy chaniyah bekarka. The way the land is sold for the mechira of shmita, it's not to give a guy any type of chaniyah bekarka. It's known. The Arabs buy up land in Eretz Yisrael for shmita, just like the Goyim buy up the chametz in your house. Technically, it's binding. Mechira is binding. The guy chametz belongs to the guy. We tell the guy every year he has a right to visit, and he has a right to take a drink of schnapps on Pesach. If he shows up, you have to let him take. But we know that for all practical purposes, it's not going to happen. The same thing with the heter mechira. As I've mentioned already, the Chazon Ish holds that it's not so. That the Issa Mechira is an intrinsic Isser, and it's not a result-based Isser, and you can't be matir. But these two mahalchim are the two mahalchim in Shlomo HaMelech, and two of the different issues that come up in Shmita. It's interesting that after the riots in 1936, the British set up a commission to partition Eretz Yisrael for the first time. And the Peel Commission in 1937 came out with a recommendation to divide up Eretz Yisrael between Arabs and Jews. And at that time, some of the Gedolim came out that the Yidden should not accept such a partition plan. And they wrote a Kel Kairei against it. And they came to the Chazon Ish that it's Aser, you're giving away Karka to Goyim. The Chazon Ish answered that if every 7 years you're selling Karka to Goyim, you're saying L'Tayelas Yisrael, it's mutter. So here also, L'Tayelas Yisrael, it should be mutter, if it's a Tayelas Yisrael. So it's interesting that the issue came back in a certain sense, Ad Hayom. If those who are giving away land in Eretz Yisrael hold that it's L'Tayelas Yisrael, and we can argue if it is, but if they hold it's L'Tayelas Yisrael, if you hold it's a heter, so technically, the Yisra of Leisechanem would not apply. At any rate, this is the issue, A, of Shlomo HaMelech's giving away of the 20 cities, and B, the issue in Shmita, is it Negeya us? For those of us who live in Chutz La'aretz, what's it Negeya us? If we hold you're allowed to sell, you're not allowed to sell the Ma'inaf Gemina. Once it's sold, it's sold. It's not so pashut. After Shmita, you want to buy tomatoes from Eretz Yisrael. They're from Eretz Yisrael, but you rely on the heter mechira. All right, maybe it is an issa loisechane. But lamaisa, the yidden, the mechira is chal. If you sell land in Eretz Yisrael, the mechira is chal. So we in Chutz La'aretz, so we can buy those tomatoes. Zok the Chazon Ish, not so pashut. If you hold that there's an issa loisechane, that to sell it is aser. So 1 minute, who sells the land? You think each farmer in Eretz Yisrael goes to a guy and sells the land? No. Like all of you, how do you sell chametz? People say they go sell the chametz to the Rav. The Rav's not interested in buying your chametz. The Rav is most likely Jewish, and they wouldn't help to sell it to him anyway. When you go and you say, if I kaif the chametz to the Rav's not buying your chametz. You're making the Rav a shliach to sell your chametz for you. The same thing, the farmers go to the Rabbanut, and the Rabbanim who hold of the heter mechira, they sell the land for the farmers. If you hold this no issa loisechane, it works. If you hold this in issa loisechane, time is the Chazon Ish. There's a klal that ain't shliach lidvar aveira. The shlichus is not chal. If I make someone a shliach to do something for me which is an aveira, so the shlichus is not chal, so then the mechira is not chal, so then there's an issa shmita. So if you want to be machmir and not be naig the heter mechira, so buying the Paris shmita after shmita is also something which is awesome. Now, this is the technical halachis. It's kedai to understand the Isser Leisechanem, to understand the message behind Leisechanem. Now, to a
כן, אני רוצה להוסיף כמה נקודות שרב רייסמן לא דבר פה, ב-13 דקות שהוא דבר. אחד, זה that Rav Kook ba'atzmo did keep shmita. He kept it his whole life. He kept shmita. And this, I believe, I saw in the Sefer by Rav Eliyahu Schlesinger, the Rav of Gilo, who quotes from his Mechutan, from the Arieli family. His Mechutan is Shver, from the Arieli family, that they were the closest people to Rav Kook. He did keep it. Number two, I heard from Rav Yaakov Yosef, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, in the years that I sat by him every day, that it is a very big difference between selling the chametz to a goy and selling the lamb to Eretz Yisrael to a goy. Now, he told stories, as brought in the poskim, that many times the goy wanted a beer factory, so after Pesach, he came and said, "We're buying it. We sold it. I want it." They have to go to a estimator, a shamai, and they have to pay him. And it was done. They did it. And same thing with the Bechor. They sell the Bechor. You can become his animal. They have to estimate it. But who ever heard of selling a person's land? They'll bring Elon Musk. They'll bring Bill Gates. They'll bring Saudi Arabia with $600 billion or 6,000, whatever it costs. They won't sell the land. It's taka bluff, unlike the selling of the chametz. Another question that we're talking about is, let's say the land is sold to a goy. A Jew can come and work the land. He's working the land. If the land is sold to a goy and he hires a goy to work it, one thing. But a Jew to do all the plowing and everything is done on sold land, zelo pashut baklal. And one more nakuda to show the great siyata d'shmaya that the chief rabbinate has, is that for many years they sold all the chametz with a big ceremony, the chief rabbis, to a fellow, a goy, so-called goy, we'll see in a second, from Abu Ghush. And after a few years they found out that this goy in Abu Ghush was really Jewish. Here's the siyata d'shmaya. Okay, thank you for listening up to here. Thank you.